will be structured. My talk will be structured in 4 parts, basically. First, I want to give you an overall overview of what are the trends of global resource use in the last decades. This is mostly from work we are doing for the UN International Resource Panel. So we are part of an international consortium that compiles data on the physical dimension of economic activities for all countries worldwide. The second block will be dedicated to a sector that is receiving currently increasing recognition and importance, which is the global mining sector. And I give some reasoning why the mining sector is again coming to a focus in the context of the sustainability debate and also the energy transition debate. In the third block, I will select one example from the FINEPRINT project, how we were linking impact-oriented information, in that sense, impact of mining activities, to models of global supply chain and international trade in order to trace the flow of impacts all the way along the processing steps to the final consumers of products. And the fourth section will be a concluding section and providing some outlook, also connecting our work to ongoing policy initiatives. But let's start with the trends of global resource use. So since many years, we are compiling in the context of the UN International Resource Panel, a global database that illustrates the amount of materials extracted, traded, and consumed basically in all countries worldwide. So this graph shows the material, the biophysical basis of the global economy in the past 50 years. Yeah, looking back at the time I was born at the beginning of the 1970s, the extraction rate was still just a bit over 30 billion tons. And as you can see, this has more than tripled to today's level. So we're just completing the next update now of this database. And we estimated we are around 100 billion tons of annual raw materials, virgin raw materials that enter the economic system. Just to give a bit of an orientation, this huge number, 100 billion tons, this is around 100 trucks per second entering the global economy with different types of resources. Yeah, the chart also shows that normally in the method we use, the material flow analysis method, we disaggregate broad types of materials like biomass from agriculture and forestry. And we have a broad category, non-metallic minerals. These comprise, for example, construction minerals such as sand and gravel or other industrial minerals. Then we have different fossil fuels and a large range of metal ores, which you can see in blue on the top. If we look at how the physical basis of the global economy has developed over the past decades, we see that the growth rates were around 2% mostly, but there was one particularly high growth rate at the beginning of the 2000s, and this was mainly triggered by the growth of China. So yeah, China grew, as we know, in economic importance, and this also translated in huge demand for a large variety of raw materials and resources, and this triggered this particularly growing high growth trend at the beginning of 2000s, and since then it's flattening again, but it's still growing. Yeah, I already mentioned this rise of Asia, basically, and the emerging economies, and many studies looked at this from an economic point of view, and this kind of complements the economic point of view with the biophysical view. So here we see the share that different world regions hold in the global consumption of materials, which we call material footprint. Looking back 50 years, you can see that at the beginning of the 1970s, the Asia-Pacific region held an more or less equal share than Europe, so around 26% were the two regions contributing each to the global consumption of raw materials. And then with the rise of China and other economies, the Asian Pacific share grew significantly. So it is now around 55 to 57%, while at the same time, the share of the European region as well as North America shrank significantly. So this points out, yeah, as we also know from the climate debate, whatever happens in China in the coming debates will have a significant impact also on the global development. And we can also see this here from the perspective of resource use, of the use of raw materials. Yeah, the data we collect on raw material use or resource use can also be related to economic variables. And I just present this one overarching graph on the global level, where the blue line indicates the growth of domestic material extraction, which on the global level equals the global resource consumption, you could say. The yellow line is the global GDP in constant dollars. And then relating those two variables, we can calculate the material intensity. So how many kilograms of material, of resources are required to produce $1 or €1 of economic output in the global economy. If we again look at the 50 past years, we can see that several stages were observed. First stage, what we call relative decoupling. So basically the economy and the resource consumption growing, but the former growing faster. So this is a situation called relative decoupling, and that's indicated also by the declining material intensity line in purple, which you can see below. And then in that high growth stage that I already talked about in the previous chart, we actually observed some years what we call a recoupling. So basically in that period, resource use on the global level grew faster than GDP. So there was not even a relative decoupling occurring at that period. And this was particularly driven by high growth rates in emerging economies, mostly in China. And then from 2014 onwards, we see a bit of a plateauing of the resource extraction, which is again mostly driven by China, for example, limiting the consumption of cement and other construction materials, which has an impact on the global level and is visible there. So from 2014 onwards, the global economy now again entered a phase of relative decoupling. I would say at least relative decoupling, because we're still far away from a situation where resource use is actually going down in absolute terms. So what we would need from a sustainable point of view is clearly an absolute decoupling, so an absolute reduction of global resource use. Yeah, just a side note, if you are interested and if you're searching for data on material use in countries worldwide, we maintain since many years an online portal which is called materialflows.net, which basically features the data set that we and others are producing for the UN International Resource Panel. So you can find a lot of different options to visualize the data, to play around with the data. We provide some background stories, why resource use is important. You can also find predefined country reports, for example, if you're interested in the profile, the resource use profile of a specific country. Then the question arises, what for are the increasing extraction of materials actually used? And recent research by other groups showed that actually an increasing share of the material flows we extract from nature is being used to build up our material stocks. For example, expanding cities, expanding building infrastructure, transport infrastructure like roads, airports, harbors, etc., energy infrastructure like power plants, etc. And some others investigated which share basically of the global resources we extract moves into the building up of material stocks. And this first graph illustrates the share or the areas which you can see in the colors here for which purpose the materials are being used that are extracted year by year. The dark blue is what is called here technical energies, basically fossil fuel energy carriers. Then, of course, we have food and feed, biomass products. And then the green area is the interesting area, which is very rapidly growing, which is called stock building materials. So this includes construction materials like sand and cement, for example, steel, timber, many metal ores that are used for long-lasting products like cars and machinery. And this share basically is rapidly, or has rapidly grown in the past decades. The black line you see here is the share or the stocking rate as it is shown here. So in the year 1900, if we look back 120 years, around 25% of the materials were actually used to build up stocks. And now we live in an era where more than half of the materials are actually used to build up the human stocks that remain, materials that remain within the economic system for many decades. And then if we, in an accumulative point of view, look at the materials that are kind of parked inside our stocks, then we find this almost exponential growth comprising materials like concrete, for example, or sand and other aggregates or other metal ores. So this is an increasingly hot topic in the area of industrial ecology and material flow analysis. And it's clear how we manage the stocks in the future will be a key area, as well as the question how we can harvest materials increasingly from those stocks instead of taking them as primary resources from nature. Yeah, then the question is which sectors are actually using those materials to build up stocks? Well, for many metals, for example, it's still the construction industry that is the dominant factor here. So here, these charts illustrate which industry uses which share of the global steel consumption, and around half of the global steel consumption is still parked in the buildings and infrastructure industry, so that the construction industry remains being a hotspot in terms of resource use, followed by other metal manufacturing industries like mechanical equipment, machinery, vehicles, etc. So this is more a classical example, and this has been on the way for many decades now, that construction is a clear dominator. But in recent years, and I'm sure you have been aware and came across some literature here as well, the focus was put on another sector that actually requires significant amounts of materials, which is the renewable energy sector. And many studies, this is a very dynamic field at the moment, indicating that the transition to renewable energy actually also has some costs, in particular, the increasing demand for natural resources. So this figure, for example, is from a World Bank study from a few years ago. It estimated how many materials are required for an average, here it's a 3 megawatt wind turbine, average size wind turbine. And the study revealed that more than 1,500 tons of materials are actually needed to construct just one wind mill. A lot is concrete and steel for the foundation and the tower, but we need a lot of cables, for example, that are constructed from copper, and we need 2 tons of rare earth elements. As you know, rare earths are particularly environmentally sensitive. A lot of this is coming from China, which is also connected to some problems of import dependency and vulnerability. But the basic message is that the transition to the renewable energy world has some implications for the material use. And just a second slide from a study by the International Energy Agency 2 years ago, who also compared different ways of power generation, and also find that with regard to specific metal ores, the renewable energies have a significantly higher demand for raw materials. So, for example, offshore wind, according to that study, has a 13 times higher demand for specific metals compared to traditional natural gas power plants. And the same holds true also for cars. So yeah, both the combustion engine and the electric vehicles, they need steel and aluminum basically for the standard setup. But electric cars, of course, require additional materials, for example, for the battery and for the wiring and cabling within the cars. So also in terms of electric vehicles, the demand by electric cars, according to that estimation, is up to 6 times higher compared to a conventional car with a combustion engine. So the message is, yeah, the transition to a renewable energy, climate-friendly world has some costs, and we should be aware and try to minimize the risks that are upcoming with regard to the newly introduced demand for those materials. Yeah, and Europe, as you might know anyway from your own work, Europe is very dependent with regard to the supply of many of the materials required for the energy transition and other high-tech product areas. Yeah, you see a large list of different metal ores here, but for example, lithium, we need to import almost 90% of the lithium. Even for copper, which we use in large amounts, more than 80% are imported from other world regions. And yeah, just for some selected metal ores, the import rates are lower, but the situation of Europe is quite vulnerable on the global market. Yeah, this was a bit of the setting against which we set out the design of the FINEPRINT project, of my ERC project. So we wanted to move, because we already knew quite a lot about the aggregated national consumption, extraction of materials, but we found it difficult to say something about the concrete impacts that these amounts of resources cause on the local environment. So basically, yeah, we decided to test and develop new approaches that allowed us to zoom into the countries, to not only work on the aggregated national level, but yeah, provide spatial detail, basically, of the resources we use. And this is important also because, in particular, in large countries, if you think of Australia or Brazil or also Chile as main resource providers, the environmental and partly also the social conditions, they can vary significantly between different regions of a country. So just using one aggregated impact factor across a whole country leads to quite distorting result. And this let us conclude that we need to move to a higher spatial resolution, and it's not enough to work on the aggregated national level. Yeah, just 2 examples here. The right example shows a biomass-related example. We are also doing a lot of work on biomass and food, but yeah, this I exclude from my today's talk because I would run out of time. But it's clear, for example, the soybean, if I take soybean production as an example, the impacts on biodiversity loss, for example, will be completely different if the soy is being produced in a newly deforested area in the Amazon, or is being produced or planted in an area in the south of Brazil where agriculture has been occurring for the last 300 years. Or if we move to the right, for example, copper mining and refining is a very water-intensive exercise. So the impact on the water body will be very different depending whether the copper mining takes place in the north, in the Atacama Desert, one of the driest areas on the planet, versus in the more temperate regions to the south of Chile. And these are just 2 examples illustrating that often the conditions within countries really matter to properly determine what are the environmental effects of our resource use. Yeah, so the whole story led us to develop this idea of the FINEPRINT project, which was about developing spatially explicit material footprint methods and data sets that allow us then to perform more fine-scale assessments of what is Europe causing globally through its consumption of raw materials. Yeah, as already said, the overarching objective was to develop and test new methods that use a higher spatial resolution to monitor global material flows and related impacts. And what we also wanted to test is whether we can link those spatially explicit information to models of global supply chains in order to trace the impacts all the way towards the final consumer. Yeah, we also wanted to contribute to the literature on what is called telecoupling. So this coupling, often very distant coupling between the consumption of products taking place on one side of the planet and the environmental problems happening often at the very beginning of the supply chain in a very different environmental situation. So connecting those drivers to the impacts was also one of the objectives. Yeah, and I already talked about the increasing demand of various resources and the increasing demand from the global mining sector. And this was also why we decided to focus on the mining sector, which is one of the most environmentally destructive economic activities that is taking place. So when we started the FinePrint project, we actually assumed that there were global databases already out there that illustrate where mining is actually taking place. For example, which land area is actually taken by the global mining sector, but we found out there was no such database available. So we decided to start collecting our own data. And what we did was to start using satellite images, which are available from different sources, to actually observe and quantify where mining is actually taking place in countries around the world. And you see here, this is from a publication last year, around the second version of the data set. We have, mining can take place in very different types and shapes. So we have some large-scale industrial mining activities, for example, the large copper mines in the Andean mountains in Peru and Chile, which could, for example, look like this. But there are also like more small-scale artisanal mining activities taking place in many countries, for example, in the Amazon, also in Peru, in Brazil, and other countries. And this is also very environmentally destructive. So it's small scale, non-industrial mining in many cases, but very environmentally heavily impacting. For example, mercury emissions from the refining, the resolving of the gold from the extracted metal. And this often leaves the landscape like this, like a rather a moon-like polluted landscape that is being left where rainforest was earlier. And we, in FinePrint, fortunately, we had enough budget to really invest into development of basic data sets that can also be used for many other questions and by other researchers. All data products and codes, etc., we develop are openly available. And here you see a global map of these land areas used for mining from the second version we published last year. The data set contains around 45,000 polygons, so areas where mining is taking place. And together, these polygons add up to more than 100,000 of square kilometers of land areas globally that is used for mining, directly for mining activities. So this is more than the size of my home country, Austria, for example. And the map shows that mining, of course, is not evenly distributed across the globe, but we see some clear hotspots in South America, for example, in the Andean mountains, in the Amazon, in Africa, in the South and West African region. Ghana, for example, is a hotspot, and also further east, Indonesia, for example, an increasing hotspot. I will come back to this in a few minutes. And of course, Australia also positioning itself as one of the core mining countries in the transition. If you're interested to explore these fine-scale, high-resolution data on mining, there is also on the FinePrint webpage our viewer available. So you can just go there and look at these interactive maps where you can have different layers of data and investigate where mining is taking place. Also now we have a second layer with production data, so you also find information which commodities are actually mined at the different sites. And then this new data set that tells us where mining is actually taking place was for us then the starting point to investigate more what are the actual environmental impacts. So for example, in one study, we connected the spatial information to other layers informing us about the ecosystem type and quality. For example, we connected the data to information about the biomes, so the ecosystem types where the specific mines were located. And one of the key results was that around 80% of global metal ore extraction is actually originating from very species-rich areas and ecosystems. Yeah, you don't need to read all the abbreviations, just to make you aware that the category on the bottom is the tropical and subtropical moist broadleaf forest, so basically rainforest. And yeah, the rainforest areas are also one area where mining has increased quite significantly, which you can see on the right-hand side, which shows the development since the year 2000. And another layer we integrated in that study was the information where protected areas are located. And also here we found quite worrying result, I would say, that around half of global metal ore extraction is taking place 20 kilometers or less from the next protected territory. And if you think of the potential pollution implications of the mining sector, this is quite a worrying result. And also on the bottom here, I just now open the pointer. On the bottom here, you can even see that the mining within protected territories has significantly increased in the past few years, which is particularly worrying and pointing to some governance issues that obviously protected areas are not that well protected as they should be. Yeah, we can also do this and break this down for a range of different raw materials. Yeah, just give you a few headline results here. If you look at the nickel, this is 3 graphs regarding nickel. Metal ore that is used for various purposes, but also required for battery production, for example. Yeah, the environmental profile of nickel is problematic because quite a large share of nickel is actually mined in the rainforest in Indonesia and other countries. It's quite close to the next protected area, so it's located in quite sensitive ecological circumstances. Yeah, quite the same profile you can also find for bauxite, which is the raw material to produce aluminium. Yeah, the last part shows the situation with regard to water scarcity. And here, for example, copper, which you can find here, stands out as a hotspot topic, as a hotspot raw material, because a large share of copper extraction and refining is taking place in very water scarce regions. And a final example I want to provide with how we use our data on land area, those polygons. For impact assessments, we can also overlay the polygons with high resolution data on forest loss or deforestation. So yeah, we use this quite famous Hansen data set, which is basically a data set informing on the global level about forest changes year by year. And overlaying this with our mining polygons allows us to assess where mining directly led to deforestation in the past 20 years. We do a lot of work actually together with NGOs because we think this is a a nice and very fruitful cooperation and communication channel. So in April this year, we published a study with WWF called Extracted Forest. And in that study, for the first time, we showed where on the globe mining is causing deforestation directly through the expansion of mining areas. And Indonesia here clearly stand out as the number one country. So 3,500 square kilometers were directly converted from forests, mostly rainforests, to mining lands in the last 20 years. The second one is Brazil, and then followed by Russia and Canada. And if we look at Indonesia, which is clearly a hotspot of that development, there is a region on the island of Borneo to the east, which is called East Kalimantan, and there really a large scale of landscape destruction takes place because mining is rapidly expanding there. Mainly coal mining. A lot of that coal is also exported to India and China, but also the mining of metal ores like nickel and tin, which is also ending up in products that we in Europe, for example, consume. And we need to consider that mining is not only causing direct effects within the mining areas, mining also induces indirect effects, which can have negative environmental impacts. For example, mining requires infrastructure, transport infrastructure, you need energy. This again can cause, for example, additional forest loss, or people are moving into mining areas due to employment activities, then agricultural areas need to be created, etc. So these indirect effects are also important to consider. And in one study that we published last year, we tried to quantify those indirect deforestation effects by large-scale mining across the tropical countries. And the main result was that we found that actually mining is inducing indirect deforestation in the surroundings of the mines. So basically, the implication is it's not enough to just look at the mining area itself, but also you need to look at what is happening as an indirect effect in the surroundings of mines. Yeah, and then we also can link this again to information, which commodities are actually driving all this deforestation that we can observe. Here you see an overview chart, which commodities are kind of responsible for the forest loss we observe, and two commodities clearly stand out, which is gold and coal. So we have already talked about coal in Indonesia. So you see here the huge contribution by Indonesia and coal mining in the Indonesian rainforests. Also quite a lot is lost in the US. Also in the US, coal mining has significantly expanded in the past 20 years. While on the other hand, the gold mining is quite distributed across many other countries, in Latin America and Africa, and also in Asia. Yeah, this leads me to my third part of the talk, just to give you one example how we link all this information about where our resources actually extracted and which impacts do they cause. How can we link this to global trade and supply chains? Yeah, basically just an overview slide how we do this. We start with what we call the production perspective. So for example, information about the land use, where mining is taking place. We connect this to forest loss maps, as I've shown before. And then we connect this to international trade models. And the type of models we use are so-called multi-regional input-output models, which are very widely used for environmental and sustainability assessments. So we selected for that study one of the available global data products. And those databases basically represent all the supply chains, all the sector connections in the global economy, be it domestic or international through trade. And connecting our environmental information to such a model allows tracing the impacts basically from the countries where the local impacts are observed via all the supply chains to the consuming countries, where, for example, private consumption, or where products end up in the private consumption or in the government consumption of certain countries. And this is an ongoing study that we still have not finalized, but we wanted to know in which countries actually the products end up that induce along the supply chain deforestation due to the expansion of mining activities. And we see that the EU in that example ranks second. So the EU 27 countries induce 14% of the total global deforestation related to the expansion of mining activities, and is the second most important player here, just following China with 18%. The US follows with 12%. And we can also break this down by sectors, so which sectors in the EU are connected to supply chains that at the very beginning included deforestation. Yeah, and some usual suspects, I would say, pop up here, like the construction, vehicles, metal industries, etc. And those results we can investigate for different countries and world regions. Here, those Sankey diagrams show where deforestation due to mining is taking place here on the left side, and all the way through the supply chains and all the manufacturing stages. How is this ending up in products finally consumed in countries on the right side? And Europe clearly has a global responsibility. We show that around 85% of the deforestation footprint related to mining is actually located in non-European countries. And then we can trace it back to the countries where the deforestation is actually taking place, like Indonesia, Brazil, Australia, African countries, and others. And just as a contrast, the profile can look quite differently for other countries here. For example, we see the US deforestation footprint. And as I mentioned earlier, the US itself has expanded coal mining significantly, which led to quite substantial forest loss within the US territory, in particular in the Appalachian Mountains in the east of the country. So the US has a much higher share, basically, of domestic deforestation, and has a very different profile compared to the EU countries. Yeah, this already brings me to the conclusions and outlook stage, and how does this all connect to policy, and hopefully can also support the design and implementation and monitoring of policies. So on the one hand, I think I've shown that there are clearly worrying trends going on with regards to the expansion of the mining sector. For example, to build up global infrastructure, in particular in developing and emerging countries, but also to build up the low carbon infrastructure that we need here in Europe, for example, for wind, solar, battery, e-mobility expansion. And in a very recent paper, we outlined priority areas of action, for example, to conserve biodiversity and make sure that the progress on energy transition is not setting us back in the progress of biodiversity conservation. And we basically identified 4 areas of action where we should place particular focus on. The first is to mitigate mining impacts to the extent possible. For example, have very strong and well implemented impact assessments before project starts. Try to assess what the environmental and social impacts will be. We need to make sure that the very rich biodiversity places, such as rainforests, are protected to the extent possible from the expansion of mining activities. So we see that it really makes a difference where a certain raw material is being mined, and we should not move into high biodiversity regions. We should think about wisely how to restore closed sites. For example, currently more than 300,000 hectares globally are used just for coal mining, coal extraction. And a lot of these sites will close in the next 1 to 2 decades. So it's the question how we can restore those sites in a biodiversity-friendly way. And the final point, I would say even the most important, is to also think about how we can reduce the demand for those minerals. So strategies for energy saving, for example, strategies for how we can use circular economy aspects to reduce the demand for virgin, fresh materials in the future, that will be key. Yeah, some last reflecting slides here. If we think about how we can limit the impacts of resource extraction, yeah, I already mentioned policy options, for example, more stronger and better implemented impact assessments of new mining projects that we certainly can expect in the future. We also need to consider that multiple drivers often reinforce each other, like agriculture, mining, and infrastructure often play together. And we also need to consider the indirect effects. So not just looking at the mine site itself, but also what is happening around the mines. Yeah, there is quite a lot going on in the private sector itself with regard to setting and developing guidelines and standards, how to limit the environmental impacts. For example, the International Council on Minerals and Mining has developed a wide range of codes of conduct, how mining companies should act in terms of forest protection and biodiversity conservation. So there is something going on here. In the NGO world, the mining sector is also receiving increasing attention and can help to raise awareness in that regard. And the second perspective is then not where the mines are actually located, but what is our responsibility as consumers, basically, of these raw materials in the end. So I've shown that Europe has a particularly global responsibility here. A large share of that footprint that we investigated is located in other world regions, but this is not limited to the deforestation footprint. Basically, across environmental indicators, you see that Europe has outsourced quite intensively and to a large extent environmental responsibility to other parts of the world. And I find it interesting, and I'm sure you're also researching on that topic, so like what are the impacts of the ongoing or upcoming EU regulations that try to increase the transparency regarding social and environmental impacts across the supply chains, and force companies to assess the risk and develop strategies to mitigate the risk. I personally see potential here in really making a step forward, but it will certainly, it's still open how strong those regulations will be implemented. Companies also we are working with, they are quite aware that in the future they need to assess and disclose more of the impacts. They need to take care more about where their raw materials are actually coming from and which impacts they cause around the globe. So we think that there will be increasing demand for analysis also around the global mining sector. Yeah, and we as researchers, I see our role here to provide independent, open, transparent information about what resource extraction is causing in different parts of the world, how this is linked to different supply chains, and we hope that we can contribute to identifying hotspot areas, priority areas for action that will also hopefully help to minimize the risk in the upcoming transitions. Yeah, that was my last slide. If you want to know more about the project or want to access the databases and codes, please visit our website. And yeah, thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to the discussion and the questions.
Thank you so much, Stefan, for that incredibly rich talk. And I know for one, I've already used the data that Stefan and his team collect on many occasions in research, and it's absolutely invaluable. So we've got a little bit of time now for comments and questions. So I will open the floor. If you could switch your cameras on, it would be nice because it makes it feel a bit more like we're in a room, those of you who feel able to. And who would like to kick us off with questions? So let me break the ice, and then I'm sure by the time I break the ice, there will be a multitude of hands will appear. So one of the things I find so interesting about what you've described is the way you're moving away from providing us with data which is quite aggregated. So the sort of nice lines that you show us in terms of the teleconnections between production countries and consumption countries. But what you're trying to do now, it seems, is to provide a much more fine-grained picture of the environmental and potentially also social, I don't know if that's included in your project, impacts of the extractive practices that you're describing. I wonder if you can just say a little bit more about that dimension in terms of the degree of confidence that your methods provide in terms of being able to really tell these rich stories about actual impacts in particular locations and on particular communities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think if we look across the whole supply chain, the confidence intervals are quite different. So we have quite a confidence on what is happening at the mining sites, and some of the indicators like deforestation we can really also causally connect to the expansion of coal mining in Indonesia, or I don't know, iron mining in Brazil. So here we have, in environmental terms, I would say a quite high confidence in the data and in the connection between mining being actually the driver for the impact. We have much less confidence when it comes to the international supply chains, because the problem we face, and not only us, but many groups are working on that now, is that the delivery structures within the large countries of extraction, like Brazil, for example, are not well represented by subnational trade data yet. So what we do in the deforestation study, basically, we have a very high resolution information on mining and deforestation, but then need to connect it to very aggregated national trade models, which is not as satisfactory as the end goal. In other areas, for example, in agriculture, there are projects going on, like, for example, the TRACE project, which you might know. The Stockholm Environment Institute and others are working on those types of subnational models, really modeling where is the resources come from, through which supply chains, through which ports are they actually exported, and that's kind of the next step we need to achieve. Then I would say we would have a much better confidence also on the different steps of the supply chains. And maybe last comment on the social impacts. Actually, the project title indicated environmental and social impacts, but along the project we found that the environmental dimension alone was so complex that we basically almost entirely skipped the social part. But we certainly have this on our radar, and I see options to connect spatially explicit data with social dimension. For example, there is this environmental justice atlas out there, which reports on mining conflicts. There is data on where are the indigenous territories located, for example, and first studies in that direction. So yeah, whatever we find as spatially explicit data layers representing social spheres can be connected to the data, but we have basically not done this yet, but it is on our radar.
Thank you so much. Other questions from colleagues in the room? It's very unusual for people to be so quiet. Justine?
Hi, I'm Sarah van den Broek. I don't know, Justine, if you had...
Go ahead. No, I couldn't see you. Go ahead.
Thank you so much for this lecture, and very detailed results. I was quite, of course, alarmed, and being a PhD in business and human rights, this is, of course, something I'm working on. Also really appreciated to have some numbers on it. But I was a bit surprised by your conclusions that for companies, what we expect is to further develop and implement guidelines, including codes of conduct. I mean, following all these alarming results, I would expect a bit more of a stronger conclusion in terms of what you recommend doing. Also in terms of degrowth or those type of recommendations. Could you explain a bit more why you're not going in that direction?
Well, I would say, yeah, I didn't draw very radical conclusion. That's correct. I think first, I don't expect the companies themselves to achieve what needs to be achieved, basically. That is why I said that I really put some hope in some upcoming regulations, which basically will force companies to assess what is actually happening along the supply chains. Where is the material I'm building into my car actually coming from, and what were the impacts? I don't think the companies themselves will do this. But the companies I'm talking to, they are also a bit afraid that they don't have the data and information at hand, actually. The supply chains networks are very complex on the global level. So there is certainly also an anxious position in the private sector that this is will consume a lot of resources, basically. Therefore, we hope that with our research, we will also be able to contribute and make it easier that this information can be accessed. I think the degrowth topic is certainly an important one. I think that the energy transition I talked about will need to take place climate-wise. So there's no alternative phasing out fossils and moving to renewables. But what is really the danger is that this might happen in a way that actually just moves environmental problems from one type to the other. So we might reduce climate problems, but then we have huge impacts on water and biodiversity and land use because we need those materials. So I think for parts of the transition, degrowth is not an option, at least not now. But I also tried to comment in the final section that we need to be very actively address issues, for example, how much resources will we use in the future? What is the scenario for our overall demand? Because I really find it very difficult to think about a sustainable future if we are thinking about further increasing material demand. So other strategies like circular economy might help here. But it remains a huge challenge. And by the way, I don't see consistent degrowth strategies that have been put on the table yet. So it remains an area where a lot of research and specification needs to be done in the future.
And even in the academic world, I think it's still a side topic that is not sufficiently developed.
Right, although it's getting higher attention recently, in my perception.
Thank you so much.
And indeed, the group who created the justice map that Stefan referred to are explicitly committed, I think, to a degrowth strategy. The Barcelona group of researchers. So Sigrid, thank you. Welcome to the EY.
Thanks so much, and thanks for this wonderful talk. I mean, I totally agree. It's of course a little bit depressing because, I mean, we kind of already knew that, and I have done some work on the deep sea bed, and there it's the same. You know, all these manganese noodles we need now to build all these instruments for our electric cars. So my question would be, and perhaps relates to the question about degrowth, how can we conceive of an energy transition and upholding all these models of green economy and simultaneously seeing that there is no such thing as a free lunch, obviously, when we have to keep the resource spiral turning. And I think your maps, and I looked at them online, they shine a really bright light on the connections between resource exploitation and climate change. So so I guess my question is there such a thing as an energy transition that we need for climate change if, like, the resource extraction that is connected to this basically leads to more deforestation and more social conflicts? And perhaps that I might add, because I worked quite a lot on this resource question. I mean, we are talking about North-South conflicts. We are talking about post-colonial constellations where still, like, former colonial powers or in industrialized countries take all these resources from countries in the global south. And so it has, like, finally, in my perspective, also a security dimension. So I was just wondering if you could comment a little bit on that conundrum.
Yeah.
So Stefan, just before you comment, I had put Justine on the spot. I just want to know if she does want to ask a question, and then we would give you the final word since we're running out of time. But you could say no, Justine, and I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. I was actually looking at the database and it got sucked in when you asked me, so sorry about that. I actually had a question on impact assessment, because I think, I mean, you make a very valuable point on impact assessment and how precise and how often they happen. But I was wondering, since when you look at your map, most of the impact happen in countries that maybe don't have this obligation to have impact assessment. I was just wondering, who do you think should do those impact assessments, and how do we implement that? Those countries need to have maybe a legal approach to have those impact assessments, because I agree we should have those, but yeah, I was wondering what's your opinion on this. Thank you.
So Stefan, we've actually formally run out of time, but if you're willing just to take an extra few minutes, it would be great to hear brief answers to those questions. And you've obviously given people lots of food for thought.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no problem if we continue discussing. I don't need to run right now. Yeah, on the first question, of course, it is a bit frustrating, basically, to see that the new technologies also have some negative effects. But as I said earlier, I think we need to continue walking this route. We just need to be very aware that it's not at zero cost, and that we need to mitigate the risks to the extent possible, and really putting the potential mining related impacts in the focus and make this an issue. Concerning the whole debate on degrowth and our demand of materials, I think we need, in the whole debate, and I didn't touch it all on that issue, we need to include much more far-reaching considerations of how a future society could work, and could work on significantly lower levels of resource use. So for example, I doubt that a transition towards a sustainable mobility system can be envisioned based on continuation of private transport as the main transport means. So just now substituting the 2 billion cars from combustion engine to electric vehicles, that will not bring us any closer to where we need to be. So I think also for us as a demander, as a consumer of materials, we need to develop completely alternative strategies, how we can satisfy some needs for mobility, for housing, the whole area of city planning, urban planning, etc. So many issues that might appear far away from the question of what are the mining impacts in Brazil or Australia, but actually they're very closely linked. I can imagine a system that is mostly run on public transport, basically, having a sustainable future also in terms of significantly reduced demand for materials. but I'm really struggling to envision a future that is basically focused on private cars. So I think, also, those dimensions need to be taken into account, and they will have a clear impact on all those topics I showed today. So that would be one answer. In terms of impact assessment and who should do it, well, I observe basically pressure from two directions. So on the one hand, it's the consuming countries and the countries dominating the global trade and supply chains. There is a tendency that tries to, through regulation and stronger guidelines, break up, basically open up the black box of this connection between the consumers and the producers. And to repeat myself, I'm really curious to see how the reporting directive, the due diligence directive will look like in the final stage after all this negotiation process, and what this means really for companies to put pressure along all the suppliers along the supply chain. But I think things are moving, and the topic is getting more into focus. I also see that some developing countries are increasingly aware of the problems they are causing related to a rapid expansion of mining. For example, Indonesia I have featured as a hotspot countries losing a lot of rainforest due to the expansion of mining. And Indonesia itself has reformed the system, for example, how they grant mining concessions. Formerly, it was very locally organized, very difficult to monitor, and stepwise, the concession system was moved to the provincial and then to the government federal state level. And this, we can also see in our data, led to a more efficient managing of the mining development. So that would be my answer. And I'm maybe an over-optimistic person, but otherwise I would have needed to quit my job much decades ago. But as an optimistic person, I would say I can see things moving. Of course, it's always too slow and not far-reaching enough, but I think this is where we need to hold on.
Thank you so much, and also for introducing us to this incredibly rich data set, which I think can really help inform the work of social scientists in really very fundamental and important ways. For those who have enjoyed today's session, and I'm sure that's all of you, just to let you know, as a big bug flies past me, plenty of biodiversity where I live. One of the other talks that we have forthcoming this semester is a talk on lithium mining in Serbia by Sanjay Bogojevic, whose name I'm sure I've mispronounced, so I hope you can join us for that. And Stefan, I hope we can all keep in touch with you, and we'll follow your work with great interest. And we really appreciate you coming to speak to us today. And thanks to the audience members also for the questions. And see you all soon.
Thanks again. Have a good afternoon.
So much.
Great. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.